Siyawuthatha umhlaba siyawuthatha. 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 Amandla! Amandla!
Welcome to another podcast of Andile Mngxitama Speaks. Today we're going to discuss a very peculiar South African problem, and that is the place of white liberals in our struggle. When Lula won the elections in Brazil, the South African white left celebrated this. And not only that, they even tried to distance Jacob Zuma from that whole situation of celebration. They said the RET forces have no business celebrating Lula because Lula is different. You know, it's very strange. Because Lula went to jail for corruption, just like Zuma went to jail for undermining the law, and we know that there is a long list of cases that he's facing. But the hypocrisy of South African white left is clearly demonstrated here again when they are able to celebrate a man who is not in South Africa, a man who is seen as corrupt, a man who is basically the enemy of the global forces. Because he's far away, he can be celebrated. But if you challenge white power right here inside South Africa, the first defenders of white power in South Africa are the white left, the white revolutionaries, abelungu abasthandayo, those who claim to be for change. I saw that they wrote some article in Daily Maverick where they were distancing themselves from Zuma whilst appropriating Lula. Now, this is an old strategy of the white left. The white left, Steve Biko, called them abelungu abasthandayo. And he spends a lot of time exposing just how dangerous this group is. So the white left, in fact, I wrote a preface to one of the New Frank Talks, New Frank Talk 5, the white revolutionary as a missionary. The white revolutionary as a missionary. And even Frank Wilderson teaches us that the positionality of the white revolutionary or the white left is really being in the forefront of the defense of the white system. Take the situation in South Africa when the Pan-Africanist Congress started Apla, the Gatyeni People's Liberation Army, which was part of direct attacking the white flesh, the white body. You know that Joe Slovo and Ruth first put energy to form MK to counter this direct attack on the white body. Umkhonto Wesizwe was formed and it adopted the Geneva Convention. And that meant that it would avoid attacking the white civilians. It committed itself to fight only the military installations of South Africa. In other words, white people, the white settler population, whose government was killing our people irrespective of whether they were in the army or not. We know that what happened in Sharpeville. We know what happened in Soweto. The white system treated all black people as available subjects for violence. But when we as black people organize against this generalized state of violence, we are being herded towards specific white targets and not the general settler population. Now, that idea of saving whiteness is generated by a revolutionary in the revolutionary movement, directing black people away from confronting the white flesh. Now, we see exactly the same stratagem, the same perspectives being mobilized in this attempt to drive a wedge between Zuma and Lula. But when you see how Zuma's policies were and Lula's, they are identical. Zuma, we know, came with a radical economic transformation where, amongst other things, was dealing with the issue of the mineral rights which must be shared with black people, land expropriation without compensation, free education, amongst others. And there was a big move in the economy in terms of black economic empowerment. We know, for instance, that under Zuma, the procurement policy of Eskom prescribed 51% black ownership, which we know now is under attack, in fact, from even some members of the Eskom board. Lula, similarly, in Brazil, was focused on addressing the problems of the poor. If just to come back to South Africa, we also know that Zuma had rolled out the antiretroviral campaign, which saves a lot of life, which saved a lot of black lives. We know that Mbeki's denialism policy had cost over 350,000 black lives. Now that's a genocide. But Zuma's policies stopped that genocide. In fact, the life expectancy of black people increased under the Zuma administration. We know that the white left protects white interests. In fact, at the time when Zuma was fighting with white monopoly capital, the white left stood on the side of white capital, demonizing Zuma, shielding white capital. Up to today, white left in South Africa, which controls civil society, which controls the media, which controls the university system, which controls the articulations of policy and generating of ideas in society, it has not moved away from that. Every time their men, Ramaphosa, Mr. Palapala, gets into trouble, they go into their ideological arsenal and draw back into the public space the Gupta project, so that we can all focus our attention in hating the Guptas again and to forget the contemporary and real ongoing corruption of white capital. So there is no way any honest person can claim to support Lula but not support Zuma. Lula and Zuma occupy exactly the same space in their nations, including international space around Brics. We know that corruption has been the weapon used to undermine their project. They both went to jail, and as we know, Lula has now won the elections in Brazil. We celebrate Lula, and we want our people to try to understand what's going on in society by analyzing very carefully how Zuma is treated compared to how Lula is treated. We know that, for instance, in Brazil, Lula was supported by the Landless People's Movement, the Movimento Sem Terra, precisely because Lula's position on land is similar to that of Zuma, of land expropriation without compensation. The poor of Brazil benefited directly from the empowerment programs of Lula, and they remembered these programs, and that is why they brought him back to power. The white monopoly capital and the white left and white interest in general in South Africa is terrified about the prospects of Zuma coming back into power, just like Lula. And that is why they are jacking up their critique of Zuma, and in particular, driving a wedge between Zuma and Lula, so that when we celebrate Lula, we do not get energized. And remember, Lula is 76 years old, and Zuma is about 80. These are fairly matured leaders. But the people of Brazil disregarded the age of Lula. Because, as we know, it is not your age which is important. What is important is what you stand for. And Lula stands for a progressive agenda. Just like Zuma here stands for progressive agenda. But here Zuma will never get support from the white left, from the liberal left, and from, of course, agents of white monopoly capital. We have to constantly put out an analysis which shows what's going on in society and expose the agenda of the reactionary white left. In South Africa, we don't have a white left. In fact, Steve Biko spends a lot of time exposing white liberals precisely because of this instinct of theirs to defend the white establishment. But of course, they do this by presenting themselves as the friends of black people. That is why they do not have the emotional capacity to emphasize with Zuma, because Zuma's positionality threatens the white establishment. And the white left, its own position is to protect the white civilization, white interest, and white capital. It is a very, very strange situation. I mean, if you think about how they've influenced the thinking of the Communist Party at the time when Zuma was fighting with Stellenbosch, came on the side of Stellenbosch, supported Stellenbosch, and they even said things like Stellenbosch is productive capital, and the Guptas was corrupt nascent capital. I mean, really, which capital is not based on exploitation? And that is the critical main point of difference between the communist thinking and the capitalist thinking. That capitalism itself, it creates profits out of exploitation. That is unethical. That's what makes it undesirable. It is not what individual capitalists do. In the South African situation, capital, real capital, is the Stellenbosch mafia. So real communists would have sided with Zuma and even the Guptas against the real capital, which hold the means of production in this country. As we can see, even Glencoe, a very corrupt entity, it was not called before the Zondo Commission. We can see that the Americans and even Britain has found that this Glencoe, this giant, which still provides about 80% of the coal in South Africa to Eskom, it is not being called to account. It is protected by this white thinking, which is produced by our civil society, particularly the media and some NGOs who are very active in attacking black people. They shall never forgive Zuma, shall never forget Brian Molefe, They shall never forget Mamadou Dumieni. They shall never forgive Brother Machela Koko. They shall never forgive Brother Saudi Motsweni, because those are seen as people who were in the forefront of attacking the interests of white capital. They are demonized, therefore, by this system that generates ideas in society to the control of the media, mass media in particular, which of course their hegemony is such that even black people end up internalizing these anti-black ideas. For you to be regarded as an independent journalist, you have to reproduce the anti-black perspective in your journalism. You have to attack those that are identified as a problem by the white establishment. And that's why we see this attempt to disaggregate Zuma from Lula. Lula represents the biggest hope for the possibility to come into the political space by those that have been demonized, jailed even, reviled in society, projected as undesirable, as criminals and corrupt. Today, Lula is president again in Brazil as a consequence of the support of poor people of Brazil and progressive forces who had to fight exactly the same fight that we have here. The biggest fight is the ideological fight, the fight of the mind. They control the mind. They tell us who we must hate. They tell us who is corrupt. They tell us who must be excluded and who must go to jail. And generally our people are colonized by this hegemonic thinking and end up supporting these projects which are anti-black. I think if we look at how Lula and how Zuma is treated by the white left, by the white South African media, you can see very clearly how their interests are represented. Lula, because he's far, is not here, does not threaten their interest, is celebrated. But Zuma, who stands exactly in the same position as Lula, is denigrated, is demonized here in the South African space. Not only that, there's an active attempt to separate Lula from Zuma. These people are brothers. I mean, we can see in those pictures, we can see whenever they meet, these people are brothers. They love each other and they represent the same agenda. And we know that at the time when Zuma was in Brics and Lula was in Brics, how powerful a combination the two represented as people coming from the third world. So there you are. The white left in South Africa is trying to separate Zuma from Lula. We cannot allow that. Lula and Zuma belong to the same progressive revolutionary left force, which must again be supported to come to state power so that they can continue with the job of liberating their people. Israel. Of course, you know, this stuff around Brother Floyd, for me, I can forgive Kanye for everything, but that is just unbelievable. Because it was a death, a very public execution of a black person. And Kanye West comes and tells us that Floyd died from drugs. Even if he was taking drugs, if there was no white knee on that brother's neck, he would have lived. We don't know for how long. It was not up to the white cops to do that. And we cannot at all tolerate the defense of whiteness when it offends against us as black people.
Siyawuthatha umhlaba siyawuthatha. 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 Amandla!